Good evening. This is Reverend Jeff Snyder, and this is Beyond Loaves and Fishes, a live stream Bible study. Oh, getting a little late start here. Just trying to catch my breath, get this thing started. I'm very glad you came. I'm glad you're taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us tonight. So, we're dealing with the book of Ruth, and we are about to begin with Ruth chapter 1, verses 19 through 22. Now, one thing to know about Ruth tonight, we're going to get into some fairly adult discussions. This is a serious lesson, and it deals with some very adult themes. And so you might not want to have small children within earshot, or you'll be answering some interesting questions later on. So just wanted you to know that in case you're either watching live now or watching this later as a recording. You may want to take some care this evening. So, if you're new, if you're watching this recorded later, come over to the J.S. Brooks channel on YouTube, hit subscribe, and the bell that shows up there, and you'll be notified the next time and every time that we're getting together for another live stream conversation. So, we're about to get started. Looks like we've got some people here now. So we will get on into Ruth. Hey, Cheney, glad you're here. Ruth on Tuesday and Lent on Thursday. That's how it runs. Yep, that's what we're doing. So we are ready for Ruth now. And, oh, yes, I was going to light the candle here. There we go. Had to move a little bit. So, Ruth 1, verses 19 through 22. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem to begin at the beginning of the barley harvest. Well, here we are. We're going to pause here for a second before we plunge in and hear what the rabbis have to say about Naomi and Ruth. It said in the story that they entered into Bethlehem on the day when the whole town had turned out to mourn with Boaz the death of his wife. That's an interesting timing right there. And they were shocked when they saw Naomi. Before she had left, the rabbi said she had been carried everywhere by servants. Now she was barefoot. Before she had worn clothes of the finest wool. Now she dressed in tattered rags. Before her face was full and full of color from the good food and the drink that she'd had. Now she was pale and her cheeks were hollow from hunger. After they saw her in such a state, it made sense to them when she said, "Don't call me Naomi," which meant pleasant. "Call me Mara," which meant bitter instead. So, this is quite the greeting that Naomi receives and gives when she returns with Ruth to Bethlehem. Surprising, it seems to us, that neither the women who are meeting Naomi nor Naomi acknowledge that Ruth is present at all. They're paying no attention to this foreign woman, this Moabite, no less, that they think so badly of those people anyway. But it is rather surprising that Naomi is silent after Ruth's incredible pledge of love and loyalty to her and to her God of Israel. Has she slipped into old habits? Naomi, upon returning home, have her old biases kicked in when she's around people she knows? She'd been pretty decent to Ruth when they'd been overseas. Hello, Lisa. Good to have you here with us tonight. When they'd been over in Moab and when they'd been on the road, but now it's a little different. Naomi's silence hints that she's ambivalent about Ruth's pledge. Ruth, the Moabite, will be both an asset and a liability to our Hebrew widow at this point. An asset because of her ability to work and find companionship, and a liability because her people are despised by the Israelites, which is going to make getting along in Israel potentially more complicated for Naomi, and potentially making it more complicated for her to get herself and Ruth established in some way that will be an asset to them both. So she has indeed slipped back into her culture to a degree. Ruth's presence goes against the laws of purity and makes it difficult for Naomi to restore herself in the eyes of society. In other words, they've plunged into a situation where people are going to be rather bigoted to Ruth, and this is awkward for Naomi. But despite the risks, Naomi chooses to live with Ruth anyway. Still, Naomi has many reasons to call herself Mara, meaning bitter, although that can't be a great joy for Ruth to live with someone who has labeled themselves bitter. It certainly will make life interesting. It's implied in chapter 1 that it's a common Torah interpretation against intermarriages. This was not the thing to do as far as Israelites are concerned, as seen with Elimelech and his son's untimely deaths. These would have been seen as God's punishment against them for what they'd done. Also embedded in Torah interpretation is repentance and the restoration of proper faith that disavows foreign family members, especially women. These are pretty tough interpretations, and not going to work very well with this relationship between Naomi and Ruth. The story also implies that there was an accepted political and economic institution that turns Naomi's, Orpah's, and Ruth's widowhood into poverty. The rules of the game were strongly biased against women, and if you weren't married, you had no way of securing your own fate for yourself. And this reveals that Israel's economic oppression of women was preventing them from inheriting property. And this contrasts negatively with other foreign countries' inheritance laws, which were more favorable to women than that of the state of Israel, or the people of Israel. I'm going to pause here for a second and apologize. I'm going to be a little tongue-tied tonight. It has been a rough couple of days with Donna Leach's sudden death and the funeral. So my energy is pretty low tonight, and I'm feeling a little fuzzy-headed. So hopefully I won't stumble over the text too much, but you'll just have to bear with me a little bit tonight. So this reveals that there's a debate in Israel about God's nature, and there's a debate in the text here about that nature as well. There's a debate over whether God is a rigid and jealous deity who demands absolute loyalty and extracts dire punishment for a man and his women relatives if they should try to survive by heading overseas where they can eat. Thank you, Cheney. I appreciate that. I will try to take my time. So that's one way of looking at it. But also, The other argument is God is loving, and his mercy and compassion transcends race, gender, ethnicity, and class. So some of this will be working its way out in the story of Ruth, and it has major implications for us today, especially as that same argument is playing out in various factions of the faith today. You can hear those same arguments that they were making back in the days of Ruth. So, how does God reveal God's own self to humanity? That's a question that is brought up by this rather thorny discussion. The scene in the plains of Moab when Ruth offers up her very Abrahamic style of pledge of loyalty and love to Ruth reveals something about God. And the author wants this to be known. The author sees God working in Ruth because she is the one who bears witness to love that overflows the boundaries of social, religious, and economic norms. So she has taken on some of the characteristics of God and made the argument that God is loving and boundary destroying. I really enjoy a cartoon I saw a little while ago, and it shows a whole bunch of people with pencils, and they are marking off little squares that each person is inside their own little square. But amongst them is Jesus, who also has a pencil, but he has his turned upside down, and he's erasing those boundaries between people, despite the fact it's aggravating them. And so you can see God in this way, as boundary breaking, and his love is extending to the foreigners, to Ruth in particular in this case. God's revelation circumvents the laws of Israel and ends up touching Ruth directly. For it's Ruth the foreigner who has the courage to risk everything for the sake of love, and not Naomi, the sweet one, the faithful child of Israel. So, in fact, it's the foreigner who ends up showing the Israelites something of what they've lost, something of how they ought to be living together and how they ought to be interacting with others. And there are times when it takes somebody outside your group to point out things to the group that have become invisible, or through assumption are no longer seen by the group. It takes an outside perspective. In contrast, the story reveals Naomi's obedience to the religious faith, influenced by her social and economic pressures, and she ends up restricting her love, like not introducing Ruth at the time of their meeting with friends and relatives. So, look how much can be said through this story in a way that people can slowly come to realize over time what is being said to them, rather than stating it baldly and then refusing to accept what's being said if it's just said outright. Good storytelling allows a critique to sink in. And you can see that in some of the best science fiction or an anthology series like The Twilight Zone back in the day. Those improbable stories were, most of the time, a critique about daily life as it was being lived. And so, how do you think these revelations speak to the differences in understanding of God, of people, of differences, whether it is race or culture or nation, religion, gender, whatever, that we're grappling with today? Do you think this is viable? Do you think that it's still speaking to us and the situations we find ourselves in? Ruth is about to become the center of attention in chapters 2 and 3. Naomi is going to end up receding into the background. So, Ruth's actions will reveal how she goes beyond what is expected of her for the sake of Naomi. And she lives up to her name, and her name means watering to saturation. In other words, she's a person of a generous spirit who won't just water a little bit, will water to the point where the soil is saturated. It's been abundantly watered. Ruth defies the stereotype of Moabite women as pagan, promiscuous, untrustworthy, even dangerous. How would you like to go and live in a foreign land where people thought of you in that way? Wouldn't that be walking on eggshells everywhere you went? That would be challenging. You almost never be able to let your guard down, never become comfortable. And I'm sure there are plenty of people in that situation here in the United States today. How many of these racist ideas do you suppose are born out of sheer ignorance? Ancient feuds, a lack of actual encounter with a person from that part of the world, lack of direct interaction. A lot of places in the U.S. they've discovered where blackface was used back in the day. And I don't mean the 1980s, but back when it was used more commonly. It was used in areas where you never met someone of another race. So you never had any sense of personal experience or understanding of the people that you were mocking with this blackface. And that may very well be the case with most racist ideas. You haven't sat down with people, you haven't talked with them, you haven't come to know and love their children, you haven't eaten dinner with them, and so you react out of ignorance and fear. It did seem that the Moabites treated the Israelites fairly when they were in their midst. I mean, would the Moabites have offered up daughters in marriage to the Israelites if they were actually as the Israelites had depicted them? Would this family of Israelite men have married Moabites if they really were as the Israelites had portrayed them? I think not. And now we're going to introduce Boaz, and his name is a mouthful. Boaz means powerful, well-respected, pious one. Can you imagine saddling your kid with a name like that? That'd be like naming your kid James Bond. I mean, that would be a tough one to live up to. That's quite a name. Boaz's actions are somewhat ambiguous in the text, and scholars have read him in several different ways. And we're going to see some of that in a little while. Sometimes he is a man who is shown as someone who shows you how to become a redeemer of others. At other times, he demonstrates love in his excessive generosity. And he takes the initiative to work around the thorny laws to help Ruth procure a full redemption for Naomi. And we'll come to understand what that means in a little while. That's actually kind of a tricky turn of phrase there, this redemption issue. And the text's ambiguity also reveals that the story continues to be true and to be provoking deep thought about many issues amongst the readers, making them ponder, for example, forcing them to ponder what actually is fair and what are our preconceived notions and how do we assess them and compare them to reality. So now we're going into the fields. Now we're going to read Ruth 2, 1 through 16. And there's more going on here, a lot more going on here than is visible on the surface, and we'll get into that a little later as well. But here, Ruth 2, verses 1 through 16. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favor. She said to her, Go, my daughter. So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, The Lord be with you. They answered, The Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, To whom does this young woman belong? He's noticed Ruth out in the field. The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, She is the Moabite, who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers. So she came. And she has been on her feet from early this morning until now without resting even for a moment. She's making an impression and blowing away some stereotypes in the process, as we shall see. Then Boaz said to Ruth, Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. Then she fell prostrate, with her face to the ground, and said to him, Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me? For I am a foreigner. But Boaz answered her, All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Then she said, May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants. At mealtime Boaz said to her, Come here, and eat some of this bread, and dip your morsel in the sour wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, Let her glean, even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. This is a really interesting passage. You get an undercurrent there. You get an uneasy sense that there might be some danger here. There's awfully specific instructions from Boaz to Ruth, and from Boaz to his young men working in the fields. And it gives you a suggestion that things might be a little darker out there in the field than we possibly imagine. So Ruth goes to the barley field to glean. It's something that's allowed in Israelite law. And this was the work that foreigners were allowed. It was, in a way, some things just never change. You're a foreigner in this land, you can go out and work in the fields. When Boaz, the landowner, arrives, Ruth is introduced by the foreman, not by name, but rather as the young Moabite woman. one who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab. She arrived and has been on her feet from morning until now, has sat down only for moments at a time. It's evident that Ruth has become known in Bethlehem as Naomi's foreign daughter-in-law, and for all the things that she has done. I guess it's kind of convenient that Bethlehem must be a pretty small town. The word has gotten out, and Boaz has taken notice. It's an extraordinary thing how Boaz sees this woman beyond the stereotypes that Israelites had of the Moabites. It was deeply ingrained in them. I mean, even the steward there, the head, the worker in charge of the field, could be seen as warning Boaz off. If he was showing particular interest, he says to him, "That's the Moabite woman, the one who came with Naomi." Sort of, whoa, you don't want to go near that one. You know what they're like. But now we're going to go back to what the sages have to say for a minute. According to the sages, the thing that first attracts Boaz to Ruth was her modesty. Now, in this way, I think the sages are having some fun at the Israelites' expense. While other women were gleaning bent over and had hitched up their skirts to pick up the grain, Ruth left her skirts down and knelt to gather her grain. While other women joked and flirted with the hired hands, Ruth kept to herself. While other gleaners went between the sheaves to gather their grain, Ruth waited until the sheaves were brought and gathered only after everything but the gleanings had been taken out of the field. It's interesting because according to the sages, the young women of Israel were acting an awful lot like the stereotypical Moabite woman was supposed to act, and Ruth herself was acting much more like a faithful child of Israel. Now, in the field, she is recognized as one who works beyond what was expected. So not only is she generous beyond expectation, she's also hard-working beyond expectation. She is excessive in her labors, just as she's excessive in her kindness. Ruth's character is beginning to chip away at the stereotypes of the people around her. Do we have any of this going on in the United States today? Are there people who come here who have to go above and beyond what is expected to chip away at stereotypes, at negative images that people carry in their heads of them? Can you imagine any group of people that might be living under those conditions now? All right, so now we get to the part, we're just barely going to get to the part that I was warning you about. Ruth 3, verses 1 through 18. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you, so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing the barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he is finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came stealthily and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin to you, good. Let him do it. If he will not act as next of kin for you, then, as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another, for he said, "It must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Then he said, "Bring the cloak you were wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley, and put it on her back. Then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, "How did things go with you, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, 'Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." Oh my goodness, look at the time. I couldn't have done better with this if I had planned it out in advance. We will get to what this means next week. And there's a lot that's going on here. In fact, if you look at various Bible commentaries and interpretations, you'll find several different meanings for some of what happened tonight that are tailored to, shall we say, different audiences' sensibilities. But let's just say that there's a euphemism in there, or not, depending on whose interpretation you follow, that takes the story and puts it in a different light. But we'll get to that next week. So, I leave you with a cliffhanger. And let's have a moment of prayer before we go. And we'll pick this up next week when we meet again. Dear God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this opportunity and the technology that allows us to come together over great distances and to study your word together. We thank you for this word that challenges us in so many ways. Challenges our assumptions. Challenges our stereotypes. Challenges the way we think about our daily lives and what we assume to be true and solid. Thank you for that. Help us to open our minds and our hearts to your word, to, in this season of Lent, rethink how we think and how we act and what we do so that we might serve you better. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, have a good evening, and thank you for coming, and I will see you next week. Same time, same place. So, have a good night, and we will talk again next week.